Hey guys, tonight we begin something a little different. Because when you think of medieval Europe, maybe you picture shining knights, candlelit banquets, stone castles, and noble lords warming their feet by a roaring fire. You know, that comforting school book version of the past. But let me ask you something. Would you actually survive even one day in that world? No showers, no phone chargers, no memory foam mattresses, just scratchy wool, cold root vegetables, and the distinct possibility of being trampled by a goat before breakfast. The truth is, life in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic, it was resourceful. And honestly, that's where it gets fascinating. Because some of their survival tricks still work. Like really work. Even in our world of smartphones and smart toasters, their ideas are still quietly saving lives. So tonight we'll stroll through those old dusty villages and discover how medieval people without YouTube tutorials or user manuals figured out how to stay warm, eat well, escape danger, and maybe even thrive. So before you get too comfy, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here at Whispered History. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here you are, snuggled up in a clean bed, probably wearing something that isn't woven from sheep hair, and maybe you've had a snack that wasn't salted pig bits stuffed into a wooden bucket. Congratulations. You're officially living better than 99% of medieval peasants. But don't get cocky just yet, because if you suddenly found yourself in the year 1325 dropped into a mud-slick village somewhere in northern Europe, survival would quickly become your new full-time job. No resume required. Just a strong stomach and an alarming tolerance for bad smells. See, people back then didn't survive because they were stronger or smarter. They survived because they had no other option. And every single day was a quiet little war against the elements, rain, hunger, cold, and the ever-looming threat of stepping in something warm that used to be inside a goat. Let's start with the basics. Waking up. Not to an alarm clock, but to your own internal terror when a rooster screams directly into your dreams. Except the rooster doesn't belong to you. It's your neighbor's. And it wandered into your one-room hut through a gap in the wall that you call a ventilation system. Your bed, it's straw. Not metaphorically, not farmhouse chic, just actual straw. And the fleas don't pay rent, they've unionized. You get up, stretch, hit your head on a low wooden beam, a family heirloom called Grandpa's skull cracker, and start the day. Breakfast, ha. That's adorable. You might nibble on some old rye bread so dense it could deflect arrows. Or if you're lucky, there's leftover turnip mash, cold, from yesterday. Because reheating means fire, and fire takes time. Oh, fire. You don't get to press a button. You have to make fire like an ancient magician with a rock, a piece of metal, and prayers whispered under your breath. Striking flint against steel, trying not to send sparks into the hay-covered floor, because setting your house on fire before lunch would be very embarrassing. Again, you use a charred scrap of linen to catch the spark. You blow, you whisper sweet nothings to it, you offer your soul, and finally a faint curl of smoke becomes a flame. Victory. Until you realize your toddler peed on the firewood last night. It hisses. You hiss. Your spouse groans from under a wool blanket that smells like 15 generations of damp sheep. And that's just the first 15 minutes. Now let's say you want to do something luxurious. something truly extravagant, like eating food that won't kill you. Welcome to the thrilling world of medieval food safety. It's not about organic or non-GMO. It's about, will this make me violently ill or just mildly regretful? But here's the twist. Medieval folks were clever. They figured out ways to make things work with zero tech, zero gadgets, and zero TikTok tutorials, like keeping meat from rotting in the absence of refrigeration. Because plot twist, no one in 1325 had a whirlpool fridge with filtered water and crushed ice. Instead, they had salt. And not the fancy Himalayan pink stuff either. Just straight up salt. And lots of it. Meat was cut, rubbed, packed, buried in barrels of salt, like it had committed a crime against freshness. And somehow it worked. That ham could sit in a barrel all winter mocking modern expiration dates. You think you're tough because you've eaten gas station sushi? Try medieval bacon that was aged next to pickled fish in a cellar where rats threw raves on Saturdays. But here's the thing. It kept people alive. It got them through blizzards, crop failures, and the tragic moment when someone sat on the last apple. It wasn't fancy, but it was genius. Survival wasn't about thriving. It was about not dying. A subtle distinction, but an important one. And while we're being honest, medieval people were basically the original minimalists. They had 5 possessions, most of which were spoons. If you lost a spoon, it was a whole thing. Like neighbors would help you search. There'd be tears, a village-wide manhunt. And if that didn't work, you'd have to carve a new spoon from wood using a dull knife and the shattered remnants of your hope. Also bathing. Not really a thing. Yes, people washed. But they didn't bathe the way we do today. It was less about soothing, lavender-scented bubble bliss and more about scrubbing mud off your ankles before the dog tries to lick it. And the water cold. Always, always cold, unless you boiled it, which took hours. And if you spilled it, your tears became part of the cleaning solution. Let's not forget how every solution created 3 more problems. You want to cook soup? You need fire. To get fire, you need flint steel and dry tinder. To get dry tinder, you need to forage. To forage, you need boots. To get boots, you need leather. To get leather, you need a cow. To get a cow, you need to marry Helga, whose family owns livestock. See how complicated this gets. By noon, you've survived more than most people do in a week. You haven't eaten well, you haven't sat down, you haven't even pooped yet, because the toilet is a plank over a pit, and there's a spider named Greg guarding it like it's the crown jewels. You're hungry, itchy, mildly concussed, and extremely grateful for your one good wool sock. The other one was stolen by a goose. But you're surviving, just like your ancestors did, with resourcefulness and maybe a little delirium. That's the heart of medieval survival. It wasn't about big heroic moments. It was about tiny, constant decisions made in unheated kitchens, barefoot on dirt floors, using nothing but instinct and stubbornness. And sure, maybe you think you'd crush it, that your modern skills would translate, that your years of air frying and online shopping have prepared you. But tell me this, could you light a fire with your eyes half open, one hand holding a child, the other, fending off a chicken, while mentally calculating if you have enough turnip mash to survive the week? If the answer is no, don't worry. You're in good company. Now breathe deeply. The fire is lit. The stew is simmering. And somehow, despite everything, you made it through the day. Well, part of the day. We haven't even started on the weather yet. Let's talk about fire again. Because in the Middle Ages, fire wasn't just a nice vibe. It was the original Wi-Fi. Without it, nothing worked. No cooking, no light, no heat, no romantic ambiance to distract you from the fact that your socks were made from someone's leftover sheep hair. But fire was earned, not given. And before you could warm your frozen toes or boil your suspiciously chunky stew, you had to play a little game called Please Ignite or I Will Cry in the Dark Again. And guess what? There were no matches, not even a Bic lighter from your dad's emergency drawer. Just you, a rock and a dream. More specifically, flint and steel. Now, flint looks like a regular stone. You might even skip it if you saw it on the sidewalk today. But back in 1325, this rock was a celebrity. If flint had a dating profile, it would read, "Hard, reliable sparks fly when you touch me." To get a fire going, you needed to strike flint against a piece of high-carbon steel, usually something like a knife blade or a little striker shaped like a sad horseshoe. The flint shaved off tiny bits of the steel, which caught fire midair and created sparks. Tiny, moody, rebellious sparks. They didn't want to help you, they wanted to vanish. So your next challenge? Convince those sparks to stay alive. Enter char cloth. Now I know what you're thinking. Char. What? Imagine taking a piece of linen, burning it just enough to make it look like failure, but not letting it crumble. You basically suffocate a rag in a metal tin until it becomes the goth cousin of regular fabric. That's char cloth. It's black, delicate, and it will catch the tiniest spark like it's auditioning for a perfume commercial. One spark, one moment, one chance to smolder dramatically. Once the char cloth starts glowing like a firefly with anxiety, you carefully transfer it into something flammable but gentle. Not gasoline, not even paper. We're talking dried grass, fluffy seeds, fine wood shavings, or if you're really fancy, fungus. Yes, fungus. The kind that grows on birch trees and looks like a haunted pancake. Medieval people called it tinder fungus. Modern people call it a reason to carry Purell. You cradle this mess like a newborn baby hedgehog. Then you blow. Not aggressively. No one wants to be spit on while they're trying to ignite. Just soft, patient breaths. The kind you give a birthday candle when you're secretly hoping your wish comes true. And if all goes well, poof. A flame, a tiny, trembling, glorious flame. It's beautiful. It's warm. It smells like survival and slightly scorched fingers. You've done it. You've created fire the old-fashioned way. And if that doesn't make you feel powerful, congratulations, you're emotionally dead. Inside. But here's the kicker, this method worked. Rain, snow, wind. If you knew what you were doing, you could still get a fire going in a storm, while crying wearing only wool and disappointment. In fact, archaeologists have found fire-starting kits buried with medieval soldiers, literally clutched in their hands as they fell in battle, because starting a fire wasn't just cozy, it was the difference between life and death, between warm stew and cold regret. You want perspective. Today, if your lighter runs out of fuel at a barbecue, you shrug and steal someone else's. Back then, if your firebox got wet, you could freeze, or starve, or die of no tea. And people didn't just carry these tools in pockets. They carried them in beautiful little boxes made from wood, bone, or horn. Some even had tiny compartments like a medieval Swiss army kit. And if you dropped your firebox, that was a full-scale panic. The same way you panic when your phone slips between the couch cushions mid-Netflix. Except, instead of missing a text, you're missing a basic human need, like heat. Let's just pause there, because it's wild how something so ancient still works. Today, preppers and off-gridders still carry flint and steel. Camper survivalists and mildly paranoid uncles have char cloth in Ziploc bags. And not because it's cute, but because when your fancy lighter dies, this still works. Flint never runs out. Char cloth can be made over a fire. Grass grows. And your lungs, well, they're built for blowing, among other things. So in a strange, almost poetic way, medieval fire starting is like the ultimate backup plan. The USB charger of the 14th century. No electricity, no batteries, no problem. Just rock, steel, cloth, and the sheer force of human stubbornness. And here's the fun part. Once the fire was going, they didn't waste it. They used it for everything. Cooking, obviously, but also drying meat, boiling bandages, hardening tools, scaring wolves, and yes, lighting other fires. Because once you got that flame, you guarded it like a dragon hoarding gold. Whole villages would pass flame from one house to another if someone's fire went out. A medieval version of "Can I borrow some sugar?" Except it was more like, "Hey, can I borrow the element that keeps my children alive through the night? So next time you light a candle with a button or click, start on your gas stove. Just remember." Someone somewhere in 1325 had to rub metal against stone and beg the sky for mercy, just to cook soup. And somehow, they didn't complain on Twitter. So now you've got fire. Warm, flickering, slightly smoky, probably burning with a hint of goat hair because your roof shed a piece of insulation right into the flame. Classic. But fire, as magical as it feels, doesn't solve one very medieval problem. How do you keep food from going bad when your kitchen is just a table and a hopeful attitude? Because here's the situation. You've got a hunk of meat. You're proud of it. You didn't wrestle that pig for nothing. But unless you plan to eat the whole thing tonight and spend the next 12 hours explaining to your intestines why you'll need to preserve it, now remember, there's no fridge, no freezer, no leftovers drawer with tiny sauce packets and sadness. So what do? You salt it. You salt it like you're trying to drive out a demon. You salt it like that pig personally offended your grandmother. And the salt, it's not some dusty shaker on a diner table. It's treasure. Literal treasure. So precious, the word salary comes from salarium, money given to Roman soldiers so they could afford salt. Yep. That pink Himalayan rock you sprinkle on your Instagram eggs used to be battle pay. Now it's a mood aesthetic. But back in the 1300s, salt was survival. It wasn't about taste. It was about not dying horribly from rotten meat. Let's go through the medieval preservation process, shall we? First, you take your meat and cut it into pieces. Not too small, you don't want it drying into sadness. Not too big, you don't want it becoming a science experiment. Then you trim the fat, because fat goes rancid. Nobody likes spoiled lard, not even in the 14th century. And then comes the salting, not a sprinkle, not a gentle suggestion. We're talking deep tissue massage with granules of sodium chloride. You coat every inch, every crevice, every surface. If the meat could talk, it would scream. You then pack it in a barrel, a big one. And you layer it meat salt, like a weird survival-themed lasagna. And then you wait. Weeks, sometimes months. The salt pulls moisture out of the meat through osmosis. Yes, science. Because medieval butchers were secretly chemists in blood-stained aprons. What's left behind is dry, salty, and technically edible. Jerky, basically. Jerky that could outlast your family. But that's not the end of it. If you wanted to level up, you'd smoke the meat too. Hang it over a slow fire until it absorbed every bit of that warm, woody flavor. This not only preserved it longer, but made it taste less like sadness Smoked salted meat became the MVP of long winters and long voyages. Sailors took it on ships, hunters carried it into forests, monks stored it behind monastery walls next to dusty books and the world's most judgmental cats. And guess what? You still eat this stuff today. Ever had prosciutto, bacon, beef, jerky, salt, pork? That's medieval technology. That's someone in a wool shirt going, if I cover this in salt and forget about it for 6 weeks, I can eat it later, and we're still doing it. Only now we call it artisanal, and it comes in packaging with fonts that cost $200. But here's the best part. Salted meat was so essential. Villages without their own salt had to trade for it. And not with coins, they'd offer wool, pottery, even livestock, just to get a bag of the good stuff. It was medieval crypto. People hoarded salt, fought wars over it, built entire towns next to salt mines or along salt roads, which is wild when you think about it. We go to the store and buy salt in 5-pound bags for $1. They treated it like powdered gold. Now let's talk quality control. Sometimes meat still went bad. Of course it did. You're trying to preserve a dead animal with salt and hope. So what did people do? They smelled it. They poked it. They fed a little to the neighbor's dog. And if the dog died, well, guess they just have turnips for dinner. Because that was the real medieval reality. You always had turnips. You never wanted turnips. But they were always there. So if the salted meat failed, congratulations, you are now on the all-root diet. Because turnips don't spoil, they just get angrier. But more often than not, the salt worked. And it didn't just preserve meat. Fish, too. Salt cod was a staple. Dry, flaky, salty fish that could be shipped across continents and last for years. If it tasted bland good, that meant it was safe. You didn't want flavor. You wanted no death. And for all its simplicity, salt preservation saved lives. Because without it, one bad winter could mean famine. One spoiled carcass could mean illness for a family of 8. And when spring came and the barrels were nearly empty, salted meat might be the only thing left between you and starvation. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Instagram worthy, but it worked. And honestly, if society ever crumbles and we all lose power, I'd bet on the person who knows how to salt meat over the person with 9 million followers and no idea how to boil water. So, yeah. The next time you open your fridge and complain there's nothing to eat, just remember you didn't have to dig a pit, kill a pig, dry it over smoke, coat it in salt, store it in a barrel, fight off mice, and pray. It didn't grow fur. You're doing great. Now go thank your refrigerator. All right, so you've mastered fire, you've salted your meat like it owes you money, you're starting to feel pretty good about this whole medieval survival gig. But now it's early spring, the salted pork is running low, the barrels are mostly empty, the turnips are turning on you, and you're staring at a single wrinkly onion like it just insulted your ancestors. What do? You go outside, not for a walk, not for mindful breathing. You go out to forage, which is medieval speak, for grocery shopping, but with dirt and danger. See, medieval people didn't just rely on what they grew or raised. They also ate whatever they could find. That didn't kill them, which is trickier than it sounds. Modern foraging is a trendy hobby where you wear cute boots and post aesthetic mushroom pics with hashtags. Medieval foraging was, "Hi, I'm hungry. I hope this leaf isn't poisonous. Let's start with the humble dandelion." Today, people pay hundreds to get rid of them from their lawns. Back then, they were the VIP of peasant salad culture. Every part of the dandelion was edible. Leaves great for salad. Roots. Roast them sort of like coffee, but sadder. Flowers make wine. Yes, dandelion wine, because if life gives you weeds, You get a little tipsy and pretend it's champagne. Then there's nettle. Stinging nettle, the plant that says, touch me and suffer. Gathering nettle was like playing pain roulette. One wrong move and you'd spend the afternoon scratching your arms while questioning your life choices. But boil it, that sting disappears, and suddenly you've got a green, iron-rich vegetable that's basically medieval kale. Except it fights back. And you better believe there was peer pressure. Kids were told, go get the nettle, be brave. Some returned triumphant. Some came back crying. Some never forgave their parents. But hey, nutrition. Now let's talk berries. Wild strawberries, elderberries, blackberries, tiny, tart, and packed with flavor. Unlike the massive, flavorless supermarket berries of today, medieval berries were small but mighty, like fruit with a grudge. These weren't just snacks, they were currency. You could trade a basket of berries for favors, firewood, or help fixing your thatched roof after a goat incident. And of course, people knew their herbs. They didn't have Google. They had Grandma. She'd point at a weed and say, that's chickweed. Eat it for your stomach. Then she'd slap your hand away from the deadly nightshade and send you out again. Chickweed was salad and medicine in one. Plantain leaves. Not the banana were like medieval Band-Aids. Slap one on a sting or eat it if you're desperate. Pine shoots. Chew them for vitamin C. Or as breath mints. Because if you're living on onions and salted fish, trust me, you need one. The level of knowledge here was astounding. No books, no diagrams. Just generations of memory passed down like sacred recipes. This leaf cures headaches. That mushroom just don't. And here's the kicker, foraged foods often made up a third of a peasant family's diet during spring and summer. A third? That's not a snack. That's survival. And unlike grain berries didn't need mills. Unlike meat, they didn't need salt. They just existed, waiting, hidden in the woods like nature's Easter eggs. Even kids got in on it. They were sent out with baskets told to bring back something green and definitely edible. It was like a treasure hunt, except the prize was not starving. Let's pause for a second and appreciate this, because while you panic if your grocery delivery is 5 minutes late, a medieval peasant would step outside, walk into a forest, and assemble an entire lunch from twigs and vibes. And it didn't stop with food. Some foraged plants were medicine too. Got a wound? There's a leaf for that. Can't sleep, boil some chamomile? Tummy troubles? Try mint or just blame the nettle again. And if you think this is all just quaint folk knowledge, think again. Modern science has confirmed that many of these remedies work. Medieval people weren't lucky. They were observant. They watched, they experimented, and they learned, all while living in itchy clothes and yelling at chickens. Today, the average person can name maybe 5 plants. 3 of them are house plants. 1 is fake. But back then, you had to know. Because if you ate the wrong thing, well, let's just say you wouldn't get a second chance. So yeah. Next time you're impressed by a fancy salad with microgreens and edible flowers, just know you're basically eating like a 14th century peasant, minus the muddy feet and existential dread. And that's the thing about medieval survival. It wasn't heroic. It was constant. Always gathering, always watching, always learning. Not to thrive, just to make it through one more week. And somehow, it worked. They walked the forests, they picked the weeds, they brewed strange teas and cracked pots. They handed down secrets and whispers, and in doing so they left us a blueprint. One for surviving without screens, without plastic, without anything but wit, instinct, and a deep respect for the nearest edible leaf. So the next time someone calls dandelions weeds, smile and say, "You mean dinner? You've got fire. You've salted your meat like a culinary exorcist. You've foraged your backyard weeds with the focus of a Michelin chef trapped in a meadow. But there's still one problem left in your medieval survival starter pack, staying warm. Because spoiler alert, medieval Europe was cold, damp, windy, full of breezes that didn't just whisper through the trees, they slapped you across the face like a wet squirrel. And guess what? No one had heated floors, no fuzzy socks, no fleece-lined leggings from an overpriced catalog. So how did they survive? One word: wool. Wool was the miracle material of the Middle Ages. It was everywhere on your back, under your feet sometimes. In your soup if you weren't careful. It kept you warm when it was wet, cool when it was hot, and vaguely itchy all the time. And it worked, because each strand of wool is basically a tiny curly sponge with an attitude. The outer layer repels water while the inside traps heat. It's nature's own climate control system, designed by sheep and perfected by sheer desperation. Take a medieval shepherd, for example, out in the hills of Scotland in the year 1328, standing alone in a sea of fog and bleeding. What's keeping him alive? A wool cloak. Probably the same cloak he inherited from his grandfather. Probably hasn't been washed since then either. But that cloak sheds, rain blocks wind, and clings to body heat like a jealous ex. It may smell like wet livestock, but it's warm, and in the medieval world, warmth beat fashion every single time. Now let's talk about the itch. Yes, wool was itchy, but did medieval people complain, maybe, quietly, into a wooden mug of turnip beer? But they didn't have synthetic options. They didn't have cotton hoodies or cashmere joggers. You wore wool or you shivered. Those were your options. And frankly, shivering was for the weak. Processing wool was an art form in itself. First, you had to shear the sheep. Not easy when the sheep doesn't want to be sheared, and you're working with what is essentially large garden scissors. Then you wash the wool, which was its own nightmare. Imagine dunking a soggy cloud in water, trying to get out the dirt, the dung, the twigs, the mystery things that you just stopped asking about. Then you carded it, combed it with what looked like medieval torture paddles, until the fibers were soft and aligned. Then came spinning, which took hours. Then weaving, then sewing, all by hand, with the help of your family. And by help, I mean your children, who are absolutely over this and want to go outside and hit each other with sticks. But once the garment was done, it lasted for years, sometimes decades. Wool tunics were passed down like heirlooms. There were probably family arguments about who got Grandma's best cloak when she finally, retired to the great spinning wheel in the sky. And wool wasn't just for peasants. Nobles wore it too. Sure, theirs was dyed with rare plants and trimmed with decorative nonsense, but it was still wool. From the prince to the pig herder, everybody was wearing sheep. And let's not forget the boots, gloves, hats, socks, all made from wool. Layer upon layer, until you looked less like a person and more like a walking bundle of farm insulation. But hey, at least you were alive. Warm, slightly moist, but alive. Wool didn't just keep you warm, it kept you alive. Without it, winter was a death sentence. Hypothermia wasn't a dramatic plot twist, it was Tuesday. That's why wool was stored, repaired, rewoven, and worshipped. If your house caught fire, you didn't scream for your jewelry, you screamed for your cloaks. And today, wool is still around, still outperforming synthetic fabrics, still regulating temperature, still being used by hikers, soldiers, firefighters, and people who live in cabins that smell vaguely of pine and regret, because no matter how advanced we get, no fleece or hoodie has ever truly outwitted the mighty sheep. So next time you pull on your soft pajama pants, adjust your thermostat and tuck yourself under a clean, fluffy comforter, just take a moment. Remember the shepherd wrapped in layers of scratchy wool, watching the snow fall, knowing that the only thing between him and death by frostbite is a very determined animal's haircut. And that is why wool wasn't just clothing. It was survival. All right, now that you're bundled up in wool like a sentient haystack, let's move on to the next medieval miracle cooking. Because you can't just gnaw on salted meat forever, and even turnip stew needs heat. But here's the twist. No stove, no microwave, no air fryer. Just use some clay, a few sticks, and an overwhelming desire to not eat everything raw forever. Enter the earth oven, or as I like to call it, the original slow cooker, minus the plug the buttons or the instruction manual you definitely threw out. This marvel of pre-electric engineering was simple, brilliant, and surprisingly efficient. Here's how it worked. First, you grab mud. Not just any mud sticky thick. I just ruined my only shoes kind of mud. Then you mix it with straw, maybe a little clay, maybe some enthusiasm if you had any left. Now you shape it into a dome. Not a Pinterest dome. More like a lumpy, wonky igloo that might collapse at any moment, but you believe in it because it believes in you. You start by building a mound of sand into the shape you want the oven to be. Then you cover it with your mud straw mixture like you're frosting the saddest cake in the world. Once it starts to dry a little, you scoop out the sand. Boom. Instant oven chamber. Congratulations, you've built a functioning oven out of literal dirt. Now comes the fire. You build it inside the oven. Let it burn for hours until the whole structure is radiating heat like a medieval tanning bed. Then sweep out the ashes and pop in your food. No flames, no coals, just the hot walls doing the work. It's like magic, but with more blisters and less wizard. This wasn't just clever, it was efficient. One firing could bake multiple batches of bread. First the crusty loaves, then the pies, then the stews. Then you throw in some apples just for fun. The heat slowly fades, and you use every last ember. It's the medieval version of zero waste. And these ovens weren't just individual tools, they were community hubs. In some villages, there was one big oven for everyone. You'd show up on your assigned baking day, like, "Hi, I'm here with my dough, my pride, and the hope that I didn't mess up the yeast again." People would gossip trade turnips and argue about who burned the last batch. It was less of a chore and more of an event, like a weekly potluck, but with way more smoke and slightly fewer awkward uncles. Now let's talk flavor, because modern chefs and pizza enthusiasts are rediscovering this ancient method. Earth ovens, also called cob ovens, today bake food in a way modern appliances just can't replicate. The crust is better, the texture is better, the vibe is better. You didn't just cook a meal, you created it with mud, fire, and sheer determination. And variety. Oh, they made it work. In Northern Europe, ovens were often built right into the hearth, cozy and central. In Mediterranean areas, ovens stood alone in courtyards, sun-warmed and ready. Some were shared between families, some were mobile-ish. Yes, mobile ovens. Think medieval food truck, but stationary and also made of clay. And they weren't just for bread. These ovens dried fruits. They roasted meats, they cooked beans. Some families even used the lingering heat to dry their laundry or warm sleeping babies. I mean, I'm not saying that's OSHA approved, but you do what you gotta do when winter's knocking and the blankets smell like last year's sheep. So yes, the earth oven was the beating, smoky heart of medieval cooking. It turned raw flour and wild herbs into survival. It gave comfort, warmth, and occasionally slightly charred hope. And today people still build them. Backyard cob ovens, camping ovens, off-grid kitchens. Because deep down we all want to gather around a fire, share something hot and homemade, and pretend just for a moment that we could survive without apps, timers, and that one drawer full of mismatched Tupperware lids. So next time your power goes out and you panic about dinner, just remember, somewhere in 1320, a barefoot woman in a linen dress just pulled 3 perfect loaves out of a smoking clay dome with a stick. And she didn't even burn her eyebrows off. And that's cooking. Let's say you've got fire food and a working oven made of mud. Good for you. You're warm, full, and only slightly covered in soot. Life's going great until it's not, because now it's mid-autumn, the days are getting shorter, and winter is peeking around the corner like a nosy neighbor with very cold hands. And suddenly you realize you need to store your food. Long term. Without electricity, without a fridge, without even a cool breeze, because it turns out the weather in 1325 is deeply committed to being inconvenient. So what did medieval people do? They built root cellars, which is just a fancy way of saying, let's dig a hole and pray. It works. You know what? It did work. Shockingly well. Root cellars were the original refrigerators. No wires, no humming motor, no awkward reminder to defrost once a month. Just the cool, steady temperature of the earth itself. These underground pantries kept vegetables fresh for months. Yes, months. No preservatives, no plastic wrap, just dirt and determination. Let's walk through one. Literally, you'd open a heavy wooden door, half hidden in the side of a hill, or maybe buried behind the house. Step inside and instantly the air is cooler. Damp. Still. Smells like potatoes in suspense. The temperature usually between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect for storing all the stuff you definitely don't want rotting on your kitchen table. Like carrots or beets. Or that one weird-looking turnip that might be a pet now. The design was genius in its simplicity. In hilly areas, people dug horizontally into a slope. On flat land, they dug down, lined the hole with stone or wood, and covered it with beams, branches, and thick layers of earth. Some even added straw insulation or vent pipes for air circulation. It was like building a hobbit house exclusively for vegetables. Inside the organization was strangely elegant. Root vegetables, things like parsnips, rutabagas, onions, were packed in bins of sand or straw. Apples were wrapped individually in leaves or cloth to keep them from touching and triggering each other's slow descent into shriveled sadness. Cabbages, hung from the ceiling like leafy chandeliers. Cheese, butter, even preserved meats could rest on cool stone shelves. But it wasn't just about storage, it was insurance. A well-stocked root cellar could feed a family for 5 months. That's 5 months of not starving, 5 months of not wandering the forest, hoping a squirrel falls into your soup pot. 5 months of eating turnips by candlelight and pretending that's totally fine. And everyone in the family had a role. Adults harvested, children layered straw, teenagers complained, grandparents stood near the door and warned, don't stack the onions too high this time or they'll avalanche again. It was a full team operation. Of course, it wasn't always glamorous. Root cellars were earthy, spidery, sometimes a little spooky. Picture this, it's dusk. You're 8 years old. Your mom hands you a candle and says, go get some carrots. You open the cellar door, step down into the darkness and immediately make eye contact with a spider the size of your dreams. Do you proceed? Do you flee? Or do you quietly whisper, "No carrots tonight," and invent an excuse involving raccoons? Modern teenagers dread bringing groceries in from the car. Medieval kids had to spelunk into a dirt cave full of bugs to retrieve a beet. We are not the same, but the benefits. Oh, they were worth it. Because root cellars worked. They kept food safe through the bitterest winters, the most unpredictable weather, and those awkward weeks when spring refused to show up on time. And today, people are bringing them back. That's right, off-grid homes, homesteaders, and eco-living enthusiasts are digging root cellars like it's 1325 all over again. Not because they have to, but because the design is so efficient. It still beats most energy-hungry appliances. No power outages, no compressor failures, no buzzing noise that makes you question your sanity at 3 a.m. Just nature doing its quiet, reliable job. And let's be real, if society ever hit the reset button, the root cellar people would be the ones still eating soup while the rest of us panic in the dark with warm yogurt and regrets. So yes, the next time your fridge beeps because you left the door open too long while debating which cheese to commit, to take a moment to remember that once long ago people built homes for carrots. They dug into hills, they trusted the earth, they battled spiders, and somehow they ate all winter. By now you've survived fire food, foraging, freezing, and fungi. You've built a mud oven, stored beets in a dirt cave, and maybe even made peace with the idea of nettles as dinner. But here comes the next medieval milestone. You need a place to live. Not just a dry corner under a tree, not a shared barn with 3 goats and a duck named Harold. You need a house, one that can survive rain, wind, goats trying to chew the door, and occasionally you. So what do you build it from? Stone to expensive, brick to fancy, wood. Maybe if you live near a forest and you don't mind chopping trees until your arms fall off. But most medieval people had access to something else, something reliable, renewable, and endlessly gross. Mud, straw, poop. Welcome to the wonderful world of wattle and daub construction. Now, wattle and daub isn't just fun to say. It was the secret behind thousands of medieval homes. The technique was old even back then, older than some languages, and definitely older than the idea of insulation that doesn't smell like animals. Here's how it worked. First, you started with wattle, basically a woven mesh of thin branches. Think basket weaving, but vertical, and much more exhausting. Builders took long, flexible twigs, usually hazel or willow, and wove them horizontally between upright wooden stakes. It formed a kind of lattice, like your walls were made of giant medieval spaghetti strainers. Next came the daub, and this was a masterpiece of human desperation and creativity. A mixture of clay, mud, straw, animal hair, and yes, manure. That's right, dung, cow, horse, possibly pig. A little bit of everything mixed together in a glorious sticky paste. If you're thinking, why would anyone do that? The answer is simple, it worked. This unholy mixture was slapped, shoved, and smeared onto both sides of the wattle frame. With hands, with wooden paddles, with whatever you had lying around that wasn't already being used to cook dinner. You packed it in, let it dry, and once hardened, the result was a surprisingly solid, surprisingly warm, surprisingly bug-resistant wall. Was it glamorous? No. Did it smell during construction? Oh, deeply. But once dry, it was rock solid, weather-resistant, easy to patch, and cheap, so wonderfully, gloriously cheap. This wasn't just for peasants either. Castles had interior walls made of wattle and daub. Manor houses, too. It was everywhere. Because when something works this well for this little effort, people notice. And it wasn't just functional, it was practical. The daub acted like thermal mass. It absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, helping regulate indoor temperature like an ancient version of a smart thermostat that occasionally cracked and needed re-smearing. These homes were breathable. That meant less damp, less mold, and better airflow, which is good when your neighbor's been boiling cabbage for 6 hours. And here's the wildest part. When well-maintained, a wattle and daub house could last over 100 years. That's multiple generations growing up in a house made of sticks and poop. That's legacy. But perhaps the best part of all, you didn't need permits. You didn't need professional tools. If you had neighbors' patience and a good shovel, you could build a house. And people did together. Communities would come together for wall-raising days. You'd see 10 muddy people laughing, swearing, tossing daub, and yelling things like, "Not that twig," and "Who stepped in the future wall?" It was chaotic, communal, and surprisingly joyful. And when something broke, you didn't call a contractor. You just went outside, found some mud, found some straw, and patched it yourself. Take that modern plumbing. Of course, these homes had their quirks. For example, the walls had to be lime washed, every so often painted with a mix of lime and water to make them waterproof and to lighten the interior. Lime wash was the medieval version of repainting your living room beige because you're feeling adventurous. And bugs, surprisingly few. The alkaline properties of lime kept pests at bay. And any insects brave enough to invade a poop wall probably had bigger problems. Today, eco-builders and off-grid enthusiasts are rediscovering wattle and daub. Why? Because it's sustainable, biodegradable, locally sourced, low carbon, all those trendy words you hear at overpriced farmers markets. But in 1325, it was just survival. You built your shelter with what you had. You fixed it when it broke. You shared the labor. You slept inside dry and warm while the wind howled outside. And you didn't care that your walls were made of twigs and manure. Because you had a roof, you had warmth. You had 4 walls and a door that mostly closed. And in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, that was everything. So next time someone complains about their house being too small, too plain, or not open concept enough, remind them you could be smearing cow poop on twigs right now and calling it home. And if that doesn't make your apartment feel luxurious, nothing will. So now you've got a home. It's cozy, muddy, slightly barn-scented, but it's yours. You've got salted meat, a root cellar full of judgmental potatoes, and a fireplace that only catches when you whisper sweet nothings to a charred scrap of linen. You're surviving. But just as you lean back in your hay-stuffed chair, smug with self-sufficiency, something changes. The wind picks up, the birds disappear, the air smells like something's plotting against you. And that's when it hits you, you need to know the weather. Because in 1325, the weather wasn't just a conversation filler or an excuse to cancel plans. It was everything. The difference between planting and starving, between travel and tragedy, between oh good rain and oh no, the entire village is floating away. And since there were no weather apps, no radar maps, no polite news anchors saying partly cloudy with a chance of despair, medieval folks had to become their own meteorologists, armed with nothing but instinct, superstition, and years of staring at clouds like they owed them money. Let's start with the sky. Medieval people read the sky like a diary. Low, thick clouds, rain's coming. Wispy, high clouds, fair weather. A mackerel sky, those scaly-looking clouds that shimmer like fish. You've got about 24 hours before it gets wet and dramatic. They had sayings too, rhyming ones because even impending doom sounds better in verse. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in morning, sailor take warning. Turns out that one still holds up. Red skies at sunset usually meant clear skies to the west, good weather ahead. Red skies at dawn meant moisture was headed your way, possibly inside your house. Then there were the animals, birds flying low, air pressures dropping, rain is near, bees disappearing. A storm is brewing, cows lying down in fields for too long. You're not imagining it, they're onto something. In fact, if the cows are acting weird, you should too. And people could feel the weather in their bones. Literally. That old man limping by the well, human barometer. Grandma rubbing her joints and muttering about the ache in her shoulder. Get the laundry in. A storm's coming. Some villages even had designated weather watchers, usually older folks with bad knees and no patience. They'd sit on benches, scan the sky, and predict your fate with terrifying accuracy. You're planting today, better plant a boat. And they weren't wrong, because this wasn't about being quirky. It was about survival. Farmers had to time their crops down to the week. Travelers needed to know if crossing a river today meant drowning tomorrow. Even things like drying meat or preparing the oven depended on humidity. The weather controlled everything, and understanding it was practically a superpower. There were also signs in nature. Leaves flipping upside down in the breeze. That's a pressure shift. Frogs croaking louder than usual. Moisture's in the air. Smoke from your chimney falling instead of rising. Either your oven's having a meltdown or a storm is creeping in. And while modern meteorologists have satellites and sensors, medieval people had a lifetime of watching, listening, and guessing with surprising accuracy. Some estimates suggest they could predict weather with up to 80% accuracy at least a day in advance. Let that sink in. Your phone, with all its technology, still tells you 40% chance of rain while you stand soaking in a thunderstorm. Meanwhile, a medieval peasant squints at the horizon, sniffs the wind, and mutters, "Better bring the goat inside." Of course, not all signs were scientific. There were omens, dreams, weirdly shaped turnips. People believed comets foretold floods. Unusual bird calls meant hail. And if your cat stared at the door for too long, something terrible was obviously about to happen. But even the myths had a purpose. They taught people to pay attention, to look, to observe, to feel the world shifting and act before it did. And honestly, in a time without radar or thermometers, that level of attentiveness was remarkable. Today we swipe, we scroll, we check apps that predict 10-day forecasts with the confidence of a magician pulling numbers out of a hat. But we've lost something, haven't we? That quiet skill, that intimate connection with the sky, that ability to glance outside and just know. Because when you live close to the earth, when you plant, eat, and sleep based on its moods, you learn to read it like a story. And sometimes those stories save your life. So the next time you hear thunder rumble in the distance and your phone says, mostly sunny, take a moment to remember the people who got it right with nothing but a crooked knee, a suspicious chicken, and a sky that always told the truth if you knew how to listen. You've made it through storms, through root cellars, through walls built with sticks and questionable mud. You can predict rain by the way your knees creak. You're practically thriving. But what if just as you're congratulating yourself on surviving medieval life, a horn sounds in the distance, a warning bell, a shout, a scream. Suddenly you're not worried about your stew, you're worried about staying alive. Because medieval life wasn't just tough, it was dangerous. Bandits, raids, political drama that escalated faster than a family argument over inheritance goats. Which brings us to the next survival essential escape routes. Yes, hidden passages, secret tunnels, trapdoors, because sometimes the best way to stay alive is to disappear. Let's start with castles. You think of them as big, impressive stone fortresses, but under those stone floors, labyrinths, whole networks of secret corridors designed not for style but for survival. If the enemy breached the gates, you didn't stand and fight like in the movies. You vanished like a medieval magician with trust issues. Some of these tunnels led to forests, others connected to wells, because nothing says panic exit like crawling up next to a bucket. Some stretched half a mile or more, dug with hand tools, torches, and determination. If you were lucky, the tunnel opened behind a rock in the woods. If you were unlucky, it opened into another castle under siege. Oops! But it wasn't just castles. Even ordinary homes had escape plans. False walls, trapdoors under rugs, hidden storage rooms behind shelves of cabbages, cellars with exits through the floorboards. The medieval motto was basically always know where your second exit is, and if possible, make sure it's behind a barrel of salted fish. Some churches even had what were called priest holes, tiny cramped hiding spaces built into walls and under stairs complete with air vents and clever entrances, usually so well hidden they weren't discovered for centuries. Think early prototype panic rooms, but with incense and Latin whispers. And how did people hide these things so well? With craftsmanship that would make IKEA jealous. Secret doors disguised as stone, rotating panels that slid open if you pulled the right torch, hollow bricks, movable shelves. Imagine living in a house where pushing a specific brick opened a tunnel and hoping you didn't forget which brick it was during a midnight emergency. Even staircases were designed for defense. Most castle staircases spiraled clockwise going up. Why? Because most defenders were right-handed, and this gave them more room to swing a sword downward, while attackers coming up had their right arms cramped against the wall. It wasn't just architecture, it was strategy. And let's not forget the acoustic tricks. Some walls were built with voice channels, little pipes or gaps that could carry sound from one room to another. You'd think someone was behind the door, but nope, just a whisper from 30 feet away. Creepy, yes. Effective, also yes. But the real genius was in how these secrets were kept. No maps, no diagrams, no glowing exit here signs. The knowledge was passed down orally, from parent to child, from steward to heir. If you didn't grow up in the house, you didn't know how to escape it. There are stories of modern renovations, uncovering entire hidden rooms, perfectly sealed for centuries, containing nothing but dust, old tools, and the lingering feeling that someone once escaped through here and never told a soul. And here's what makes it truly medieval. They didn't just build these escape routes for war. They built them for everything. From tax collectors to jealous neighbors, from in-laws to religious persecution. Because when you live in a world that can shift from peace to panic in a heartbeat, knowing how to vanish is just good manners. Even the materials used were strategic. Hollow wooden beams, loose floor tiles, curtain rods that lifted like levers. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparedness. And guess what? Some of these concepts are still used today. Safe rooms, hidden storage, panic buttons, secret exits in embassies and government buildings, all rooted, pun intended, in techniques developed by people who wore wool cloaks and thought privacy meant hiding behind a chicken coop during a raid. So next time you feel overwhelmed by modern life deadlines, group texts, too many browser tabs, take a deep breath and imagine you're standing in your medieval home. You hear trouble. You grab your firebox. You tap the wall. just so. A door creaks open. You step into darkness. You vanish. And somewhere behind you, the enemies are still trying to figure out how a cabbage shelf just swallowed a person whole. Now that's medieval magic. All right? You've dodged danger, slipped through trapdoors, and vanished like a medieval ninja with a knack for carpentry. But even if you've survived battle-bad weather and boiled turnips, there's still one threat lurking behind every wooden beam, every moldy wall, every slightly suspicious goat. And that is getting sick. Because let's be honest, medieval life was a full contact sport. You were always one bad stew or infected splinter away from meeting your maker. No antibiotics, no hospitals, no emergency hotline. If you fell off a roof while fixing your chimney with twine, and hope you were at the mercy of whatever plants your local healer had lying around in a bag that smelled vaguely like dirt and disappointment. But don't underestimate those plants. Medieval people may not have had modern medicine, but they had centuries of herbal wisdom passed down from healer to apprentice mother to daughter monk to monk. They didn't have a pharmacy. They were the pharmacy. Let's start with the heavyweight champion of medieval medicine, garlic. Oh yes. The same thing you used to season your pasta was once a medicinal powerhouse. Garlic was antibacterial, antiviral, and vaguely terrifying when chewed raw. It was used to treat infections, boost the immune system, and scare away more than just vampires. Healers mashed it into poultices, rubbed it on wounds, or simply told patients to swallow it whole and hope for the best. Medieval breath mints must have had their work cut out for them. Then there was willow bark, the medieval answer to aspirin. Containing salicin, which works just like modern painkillers, it was brewed into a bitter tea to treat headaches, fevers, and sore joints. You'd sit by the fire drinking what basically tasted like boiled tree sadness, but within a few hours you'd start to feel better. Or at least too exhausted to complain. Need something to stop bleeding. Enter yarrow, a humble plant growing in meadows and ditches, but known across Europe as soldier's woundwort. Soldiers carried dried yarrow into battle to press into open cuts. Why? Because it worked. It constricted blood vessels and promoted clotting. Plus, it looked like you knew what you were doing when you showed up to a duel with a pocket full of weeds. And for the aches and digestive chaos that came from, well, everything medieval people turned to chamomile and mint. These weren't just tea flavors. They were legitimate medicine. Brewed gently and sipped slowly, they helped soothe upset stomachs, ease nerves, and calm sleepless minds. Imagine lying on a straw mattress belly, full of questionable goat cheese, and sipping a warm mug of mint tea while someone outside is yelling at a goose. That's self-care 1320 style. But medieval medicine wasn't just about drinking weird teas and hoping the stars aligned. Healers got creative. They made poultices, mushy herbal pastes applied directly to wounds. A common recipe, bread soaked in wine mixed with thyme, sage, and sometimes honey. Why? Because thyme and sage kill bacteria. Honey seals the wound in bread. Well, it keeps everything in place while making you smell like a sandwich. Medieval herbalists didn't just guess. They documented everything. Monks and monasteries filled entire manuscripts with plant drawings, notes, recipes, and terrifyingly specific instructions like apply before the second crow of the rooster, or only harvest during a full moon while facing east. Was some of it superstition? Definitely. Was some of it good advice wrapped in poetic nonsense? Also yes. And here's the shocker. A lot of it actually worked. The World Health Organization estimates that about 25% of modern medicines can be traced back to traditional plant remedies. So when medieval folks rubbed garlic on their wounds or chewed willow bark for pain, they weren't just playing witch doctor, they were laying the groundwork for real pharmacology in itchy tunics with 0 degrees. Of course, not all cures were brilliant. Some were, let's say, experimental, like wearing a dried toad around your neck to cure a sore throat, or stuffing herbs into your ears to chase away evil spirits. But even these strange rituals often had a psychological effect. If you believed the toad helped, maybe your brain calmed down enough to let your body heal, or maybe you were just too embarrassed to keep complaining. But it wasn't all trial and error. It was community knowledge. Every village had someone who knew what bark to boil, what flower to chew, what root to dig up when your tooth felt like it was planning a coup. These herbalists were the backbone of medieval healthcare, equal parts botanist midwife and miracle worker. And healing wasn't just for the body. People brewed lavender and lemon balm for the anxious and grieving. They made compresses of sage for those with fevers and paranoia. Healing was holistic, physical, emotional, spiritual. Because when the world outside was dangerous and uncertain sometimes, the best medicine was a warm herb, a gentle voice, and a promise that yes, you would make it through the night. So the next time you pop a painkiller or dab on an antiseptic cream, take a moment to thank the people who figured it all out, with nothing but plants' patience and an extremely high tolerance for trial and error. Because in a world without prescriptions or policies, survival didn't come in a bottle, it came in a garden, and in the quiet hands of someone who knew that healing, like survival itself, was often rooted in the simplest things. Let's imagine it's late January in your medieval village. The snow hasn't melted in weeks. The root cellar's feeling a little empty. The last of the onions is starting to sprout something that looks like a science project, and even the mice seem to have packed up and moved to warmer quarters. You've still got fire, you've still got wool, you've still got that weird jar of pickled something nobody's brave enough to open. But what's keeping you alive? Preserved meat. Yes, again. Because medieval survival wasn't just about growing or hunting food. It was about keeping it around long after anything fresh had the good sense to rot and disappear. That's where preservation became an art form. Now we already talked about salt, generously rubbing your meat like you're trying to exfoliate a pig into the afterlife. But what if you didn't have enough salt or wanted extra insurance against the forces of rot mold and mysterious medieval fridge goblins? That's when you turn to the double whammy, smoking and drying. Let's start with smoking. Picture a small hut, low roof, no windows, and more smoke than a wizard convention. You hang your meat from the beams, strips of pork, rabbit, sometimes even fish, and build a slow, smoldering fire underneath. Not roaring flames. No, that would cook it. You want just enough smoke to kiss the meat over hours, days, even a week. You're flavoring it, drying it, coating it in an invisible armor made of ash and aroma. The meat comes out dark, firm, and infused with a scent that says, I have fought bacteria. And I have won. People built special smokehouses or just smoked meat over the hearth. When cooking meals, it was slow, it was stinky, it was effective. And here's where it gets fun. Every family had their own smoking recipe. Different woods gave different flavors. Birch mild, oak strong, applewood fancy. Your meat didn't just keep it had personality. Now let's talk about drying. Meat could also be cut thin, hung up in the rafters, and simply air dried. No flames, just time, air, and a little bit of faith. This method was common in mountainous regions or during hot, dry months. Imagine strips of beef waving gently over the kitchen fire like little edible flags of survival. After a few days or weeks, they'd be stiff, shriveled, and fully preserved. Think of it like beef jerky, but not sold in gas stations, and definitely not teriyaki flavored. Medieval people didn't waste a thing. Organs dried and eaten, fat rendered and stored, bones boiled into broth or split for the marrow. Even blood was mixed with oats or herbs to make sausages. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was practically illegal in the eyes of survival. And what about fish, salted cod, dried herring, smoked eel? Seafood preservation was its own saga. In coastal towns, fish were cleaned, laid out on wooden racks, packed in salt, and left to sunbathe like scaly sunbathers. In winter, they froze naturally. In warmer seasons, smoke and wind did the trick. These preserved fish became trade staples, shipped across Europe, fed to armies stored in monasteries. If you were Catholic during Lent, preserved fish was your best friend, or worst enemy depending on how many days in a row you had to eat it. But whether it was meat or fish, the goal was the same: make it last. Make it through the hunger gap. Make it to spring. Make it until something green finally poked through the soil and said, "Hey, you made it." Modern people talk a lot about shelf life. Medieval people talked about life. Because if you opened your cupboard and didn't find something smoked, salted, or dried, you weren't just disappointed. You were in real trouble. And yet preserved meats weren't just survival food, they were culinary traditions. Recipes were passed down. Special cuts were reserved for winter feasts. Even today we're still eating them: bacon prosciutto, pancetta, salami, jerky. These aren't old-fashioned, they're ancient and still delicious. So next time you bite into a slice of bacon, pause. Take a moment to appreciate the generations of trial, error, and accidental food poisoning it took to perfect that bite. Remember the men and women who stood in smokehouses, who salted meat in barrels with frozen fingers, who dried fish while birds tried to steal it from the rafters. Because thanks to them, you're not just having a snack, you're tasting survival. A slice of history, preserved. So you've got meat hanging from the rafters, cheese, aging in the root cellar, and firewood stacked like you're preparing for a winter that lasts until the next century. You're eating well, sleeping warm, and miracle of miracles, still alive. But even the best medieval pantry couldn't guarantee a full stomach every day. There were bad harvests, there were long winters, there were rats with advanced degrees and sneaking past traps, and sometimes even after all the salting, smoking, drying, and desperate praying, the food simply ran out. And when it did, you turned to the forest. Because in the Middle Ages, hunting and trapping weren't weekend hobbies or vacation activities with camo vests and Instagram captions. They were raw, gritty, quiet forms of survival. You weren't shooting for sport. You were setting traps with a stick, a string, and a prayer that something small and furry would wander into it by morning. Let's start with the basics. Medieval peasants didn't have guns. No crossbows for the common man. Maybe a knife, maybe a club, maybe a slingshot if you were lucky or creative. But what they did have was time, patience, and an intimate understanding of how woodland creatures think. They set snares, simple loops of twine or animal gut anchored to a bent sapling or pegged into the ground. When a rabbit passed through, and nudged the loop snap. The noose tightened. Dinner, hopefully. They dug pit traps covered with leaves and twigs, deep enough to catch unsuspecting creatures, or occasionally drunk neighbors if you forgot to put up a warning sign. They built deadfall traps, heavy stones propped up with sticks, baited with scraps. One wrong move from a curious rodent and boom, gravity did the hard work. No meat. They even caught frogs, snails, eels, and birds, using nets, woven baskets, and sheer stubbornness. If it moved and didn't talk, it was fair game. And don't forget the decoys. Hunters smeared animal dung, rubbed leaves on their hands, masked their scent with smoke. They moved like shadows. They knew where foxes denned, where badgers walked, where squirrels buried their secret nut stash. It wasn't glamorous. You could spend an entire day tracking a squirrel only to trip, fall into a puddle, and go home with nothing but wet socks and an existential crisis. But sometimes you'd come back with a rabbit, a handful of birds, or on a very lucky day, a small deer. And that meant the stew pot was full again. Now, if you were a peasant living near a nobleman's land, hunting came with a bonus challenge: not getting arrested. Because guess what? Forests didn't belong to everyone. They belonged to the king or the duke or Lord Fancy Boots of wherever. Even the animals were considered property. A rabbit in the woods wasn't wildlife, it was trespassing livestock, and technically not yours to catch. So peasants hunted illegally, at night, in secret, using quiet methods that left little trace. Getting caught could mean fines, public shaming, or worse. But starvation didn't care about property rights, and desperation made people bold. Some even trained dogs or ferrets to help them flush animals from burrows. Others used birds of prey, falcons or hawks, to hunt for them if they could learn the art. It was dangerous, it was exhausting, but it was sometimes the only option. And through all of this, the knowledge of trapping, like everything else, was passed down from father to son, from grandmother to wide-eyed child. This knot holds better in rain. That bait works better in winter. Never trust a rabbit track. In the snow it loops. Even children learned to watch the woods. They knew which paths the foxes used, where to place a snare just right, how to sit so still that birds forgot you were there. The forest wasn't just background, it was a map, a pantry, a classroom. And the most skilled trappers, they could walk through a thicket and see an entire invisible city, trails, prints, droppings, broken twigs, all signs. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To them, it was a dinner menu written in leaves and dirt. Fast forward to now, and most of us couldn't trap a rabbit if it introduced itself and walked into our kitchen. We've forgotten the silence, the stillness, the patience. But back then, it wasn't just about catching meat. It was about understanding nature, living with it, anticipating it, not trying to dominate it, but moving in rhythm with it. So the next time you're staring into a fridge full of options and still complaining, you have nothing to eat, imagine standing in the cold at dawn, watching a tiny loop of string sway in the wind, hoping the forest has mercy. And when that string finally jerks, when the snare tightens and a rabbit kicks up the leaves, you don't cheer. You breathe, you nod, you whisper thank you. Because in that moment, you're not just feeding your body, you're keeping your story going. One trap, one meal, one quiet victory at a time. So now you've hunted a rabbit or maybe outwitted a squirrel with the confidence of a woodland chess master. You've got meat in the pot fire on the hearth and a roof made of sticks, poop and blind optimism. And as you sit there in your wool tunic, still slightly damp, you realize something else. something big, something terrifying. Everything you own could break. Your knife could snap. Your pot could crack. Your shoes could fall apart halfway through walking 10 muddy miles. Your roof could sag. Your shovel could splinter. Your only spoon could vanish into the stew and never return. And there's no Amazon, no same-day shipping, no medieval customer service hotline. So what do? You fix it. Or better yet, you make a new one from scratch. Using nothing but what the forest gives you and what your brain barely remembers from watching Grandpa do it once during a thunderstorm in 1312. Because in the Middle Ages, being handy wasn't a quirky hobby. It was survival. If something broke, you didn't throw it out. You cursed, creatively rolled up your sleeves, and rebuilt it using whatever you had lying around, including bark bone and bits of last year's cartwheel. Let's talk about tools. A knife wasn't just a knife, it was a lifeline. You used it to skin animals, carve wood, cook food, even make more tools. So if your blade chipped, you sharpened it with a rock. If it snapped, you might melt down scrap metal in a fire hot enough to blister your eyebrows, then reshape it into a usable edge. Was it pretty? No. Did it work? Often shockingly, yes. Handles were carved from wood, straps were braided from animal sinew, rivets were made from nails pounded flat and repurposed with the same kind of stubbornness you apply today when trying to fix a jammed printer. Pots. If you had metal ones, you guarded them like treasure. If they cracked, you patched them with solder or clay. Ceramic pots. You could glue them together with a paste made from egg whites and ash, or just turn the broken bits into drainage tiles. Nothing went to waste. Even your mistakes became useful somehow. And shoes, oh shoes, were a journey. Leather soles wore down fast. Medieval people repaired them with more leather wood inserts, or just walked barefoot until they grew enough callus to qualify as hooves. Some folks learned to make their own boots entirely. Cut leather from a hide soak it, shape it, stitch it with gut or flax. Were they stylish? Not exactly. But they kept the mud out mostly and didn't cost you a week's wages. Even clothes were patched endlessly. There was no out of fashion when your only shirt also doubled as your formal wear, sleepwear, and emergency towel. Tiers were sewn with care. Holes were covered with scraps. Sometimes entire garments were franken-stitched together from 5 older ones, like a walking family history, held together by thread and optimism. Kids learned these skills early. You'd see 10-year-olds sharpening sticks into fish spears, teenagers weaving baskets or carving bowls, adults crafting belts, ropes, tools, even musical instruments if they had time, and let's be honest, they rarely had time. But somehow they made time. Because every object they used was something they either built, bartered for, or inherited from someone who did. Let's not forget animal bones and horns. Nothing from a kill went to waste. Bones became needles, awls, buttons, handles, and even hair combs. Horns were shaped into spoons, drinking cups, and in some regions, musical instruments that sounded like a wounded goose, but were very impressive nonetheless. And when something truly broke, beyond repair, you recycled it. Metal was melted, wood was reshaped, cloth became rags, and those rags they'd clean tools, wrap wounds, plug leaks, stuff pillows, and eventually become part of the next compost heap. The medieval waste cycle was circular, thorough, and weirdly elegant. And here's the beautiful part. It wasn't just about function. A lot of these homemade items were decorated, carved, painted, personalized. You didn't just make a spoon, you made your spoon with a notch that fit your thumb just right. You didn't just repair your cloak, You embroidered a pattern into the patch because, hey, you were already there, and beauty mattered even in hard times. Making things wasn't a job, it was a way of life, a rhythm, a quiet resilience that said, I will build what I need with what I have where I am. And that spirit, it's still with us, in DIY videos in backyard sheds, in people who fix their old bike instead of buying a new one, in the joy of using something your hands made even if it wobbles or leaks or smells faintly of desperation. So next time you feel useless because you don't know how to change a tire or sew on a button, remember someone once built an entire cooking pot out of clay grass and brute force, and then made soup in it for the 5th time that week. You don't need perfection. You just need persistence and maybe a good stick. You've built things. You've fixed things. You've turned bones into tools, bark into rope, and your only shirt into a multi-use masterpiece of medieval engineering. But survival wasn't just about what you could hunt, cook, or cobble together with goat sinew and prayer. It was also about who you had around you. Because in the Middle Ages, no one survived alone. Isolation wasn't just lonely, it was deadly. You needed people. You needed community. You needed someone to watch your back while you tried to trap a rabbit, someone to help patch your roof after the wind made its opinion known, someone to trade with when all you had was turnips and what you really needed was not turnips. That's why medieval life ran on a quiet, powerful system we'd probably call today unspoken survival agreements. There were no formal contracts, no apps, no 5-star ratings, just mutual dependence built over years of shared winters, shared work, and shared meals that usually involved something boiled. Let's say you had salt. Your neighbor had firewood. You didn't make a deal, you swapped, knowing they'd come through next time when you needed eggs, and all you had was a sheep that kept glaring at people. You helped raise their barn. They helped dig your root cellar. You fixed their cartwheel. They watched your kids while you tried to catch a runaway pig. It was a social economy built on favor, skills, and reputation. Because back then, your name was your currency. If people knew you as honest, reliable, willing to share what little you had, they remembered. And when your oven cracked or your goat vanished mysteriously into the forest again, someone would show up with tools or bread or a sympathetic shrug and an extra blanket. Of course, if you were selfish, stingy, or unkind, they remembered that too. But most people understood tomorrow it might be them who needed help. So they shared salt, meat, wool, labor advice, laughter, warnings about suspicious mushrooms, and even stories to keep spirits up on dark winter nights. Even festivals and feast days were community events, not just for fun, but to remind everyone we're in this together. You brought what you could. Someone brought cider. Someone brought old carrots. Someone brought a lute and couldn't play it, but hey, effort counts. And the church, sure, it played a spiritual role, but it was also a logistics hub, a place to exchange goods, hear news, organize help for the sick, the grieving, the just got kicked by a horse. Crowd. It was where you found out who needed firewood, who had extra grain, who was having a baby, and needed a midwife who didn't faint at the sight of blood. There were no safety nets. So you became the net. And yes, families were essential. But even families had limits. People leaned on neighbors, on godparents, on traveling merchants who might carry letters or stories or seeds from faraway lands. And if someone fell ill or their barn burned down or a child went missing in the woods, people showed up with food, with tools, with time, Not because it was easy, but because they knew one day you might be the one needing help. And that's what makes medieval resilience so beautiful. It wasn't just about clever tools or hard work, it was about interdependence, a quiet web of trust and effort that made life just livable in a world that often tried to make it not. It's a reminder that the strongest survival skill might not be fire starting or meat smoking or identifying edible weeds by moonlight. It might just be kindness, consistency, showing up. Because you can learn to trap rabbits, you can learn to patch a roof, you can even learn to enjoy dried fish if you squint hard enough. But you can't survive a medieval winter alone. So next time you lend a tool, or help a neighbor, or pass along an extra loaf of bread, know that you're keeping an ancient tradition alive. One that predates city systems and Wi-Fi. And in a world full of uncertainty, that quiet kind of loyalty might be the most powerful survival skill of all. At this point, you've built a house, preserved food like a champion, dodged bandits, tracked rabbits, stitched your only pair of pants back together 3 different ways, and managed to avoid both frostbite and starvation through pure grit, goat luck, and garlic. But now that you're sitting by the fire, chewing on a very dry piece of something formerly known as meat, you start to realize the things you've been doing aren't just survival tricks. They're not just how to get by hacks or quirky historical tidbits. They're a legacy. Because here's the truth. So much of what we think of as modern innovation is really just polished medieval brilliance. Let's take it from the top. You're probably still eating preserved foods, cured meats, pickles, cheese, aged in basements cooler than your ex's text replies. And what are they but descendants of the same salting, drying, and cellaring techniques perfected by someone who didn't even have shoelaces? Your clothes? Sure, maybe they're not made from wool spun on a wooden spindle, but that hoodie's job keeping you warm, wicking away sweat, lasting longer than expected, is the same job wool cloaks did for 1,000 years. And they did it with style. Itchy, smoky, mud-stained style. Even your kitchen owes a debt to the past. Slow cooking. That's a medieval clay oven without the threat of it collapsing. Fermentation. Thank the villagers who drank sour ale and called it a good year. Root vegetable stew pots, even sourdough bread. None of this is new. It's just rediscovered. You like community-supported agriculture. That's a village harvest shared by everyone. Off-grid living. That's just living in 1325. DIY home repairs. You think patching drywall is hard? Try rebuilding your roof with straw prayer and a forked stick. And yes, even technology today is just a cleaner, shinier version of what people have always done. Communication, they had messengers and bells, information monks copying books by candlelight. Security, a good shovel, a smarter escape tunnel, and knowing which neighbor owed you a favor. But what really lingers, what really survives is the mindset. That combination of practicality and creativity, the ability to make do with less, to repair instead of replace, to observe the world closely, to treat waste as failure, to build with your hands and feed with your garden and plan for a winter that doesn't care how clever you think you are. And that mindset, it didn't vanish. It's still out there. In homesteaders, gardeners, blacksmith hobbyists, in bread bakers who name their sourdough starters like family members, in kids who build forts in the woods and don't come in until dark, in people who choose the hard way on purpose just to see if they still can. Because there's something pure about it, something quietly heroic. The knowledge that if everything fell apart, if the power went out, if the stores closed, if the noise of modern life went silent, you could still light a fire. bake bread, trap a meal, patch a hole, heal a wound, help a neighbor, you'd survive. Not because you had gadgets, but because you had skills passed down through generations, whispered, practiced, perfected. So the next time someone calls medieval life simple, remind them there's nothing simple about building a functioning life from mud, ash, twine, bone, and time. That's not simple. That's genius. And it's still with us, woven quietly into the fabric of modern life. Waiting, ready, just in case the lights go out and the real world begins again. And now, as the embers of this long journey glow gently in the hearth of your imagination, let's ease into the quietest part of the night, the moment when survival gives way to stillness and the lessons of the past wrap around you like a woolen blanket, soft from years of use. Because if there's one truth that hums softly beneath everything we've explored tonight, it's this: survival was never the goal. The goal was continuity, keeping life moving, keeping stories told, keeping bread rising and fires warm, and children sleeping safely in hay-filled corners while the wind howled outside. So as you lie back, perhaps in a room lit only by the glow of a phone screen or the whisper of a night lamp, think about this. You've just walked through centuries of human resilience, wearing borrowed boots, feeling the bite of wind from forgotten winters, carrying torches lit by hands you'll never meet. And yet they carried you here, not with glory, not with speeches or statues, but with boiled turnips, hand-stitched cloaks, and endless careful adjustments, the fire they made. You still feel it? The tools they shaped. You still use versions of them, the ways they endured. You've inherited them, tucked inside your daily rituals. You might not churn butter or mend your own socks, though, hey, that's a fun weekend project. But every time you find creative joy in simplicity, every time you share what you have, every time you fix, instead of toss, or learn instead of scroll, you're continuing something. And maybe they'd smile at that. So tonight, let that thought settle into your chest, like the last sip of warm broth. You belong to a lineage of quiet brilliance. You've made it this far not because life was easy, but because someone centuries ago figured out how to smoke fish with damp leaves and taught someone else who somehow, through miracle or mud, taught you. And even now, as your eyes grow heavy and the medieval cold gives way to the warmth of sheets and silence, know this: you are not alone. You're part of a story, and the story continues. So now let's soften everything. Let's set down the tools, fold up the maps, and blow out the candles flickering in our imagination. You've walked barefoot through the damp mud of medieval mornings, squinted through chimney smoke, tasted bitter roots and sharper wisdom. And now it's time to rest, not just your body, but the curious corners of your mind that wandered so far tonight. Take a breath. Slower. Feel your ribcage rise like the thatched roof of a cottage. Let it fall again like dusk settling over a hilltop. There's no more need to hunt, to fix, to prepare to survive. Not now, not here. You're safe in the soft present, held by the gentle echo of lives long gone, yet somehow still whispering. The world they built was fragile, mud and thread, flame and guesswork, but it lasted. And maybe that's the most beautiful part: fragile things can endure. So whatever you carry, worries, noise, dreams, set them down. Let them wait until morning. Tonight you don't need to solve or remember. You only need to drift. Let your thoughts grow blurry at the edges like a manuscript left in the rain. Let your breath match the rhythm of a horse's slow step on a quiet dirt path. And let the darkness wrap around you, not like fear, but like fur, like safety, like sleep. Shh. You've done enough, you've seen enough, and you've survived the Middle Ages.